it's always an honor when you get the opportunity to share your story. And my story is kind of unique. I'm actually visiting here from North Little Rock, Arkansas, just in case you all are trying to figure out my accent. I'm originally from Tuskegee, Alabama. And an interesting thing happened when I relocated to Little Rock over 25 years ago. On November the 1st of 1999, I was invited to go on a blind date. And at that blind date, I met my husband, my future husband, Terry Wright. And what was interesting, as I always say, it was his first blind date and my last blind date. But we connected pretty fast, but because of my pharmaceutical background, I knew something wasn't quite right. As soon as he would eat something, he would get sick and have to bring it back up. He would spend a lot of time just appearing to suffer in pain, and he was making quite a few trips to the emergency room. And that wasn't a game changer for me. I just knew something wasn't right. Well, pretty quickly, things probably went from bad to worse. And following us getting engaged and married a year later, we didn't rush it, we took our time. Things got so bad that my husband ended up having an 8-hour surgery, a pancreaticojejunostomy, because his pancreas was in such bad shape from chronic pancreatitis that he needed intervention. Well, we went on for another 17 years of hospitalizations, surgeries, sickness, suffering, wondering, what is this mysterious disease? And about a year after we met, something really unique happened. Again, because of my pharmaceutical background, I kind of knew the symptoms of pneumonia. And when he was complaining about his chest hurting, I said, well, let's go to the walk-in clinic. We go to the walk-in clinic, and after the doctor examines him, he said, if you were not Black, I would say you had cystic fibrosis. That was our first time hearing the term cystic fibrosis. And it would be another 17 years later that the term cystic fibrosis came up again. At the age of 54, after a lot of surgeries and research and hope and prayers, my husband was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. And so because of his journey and understanding a lot of the gaps as it pertains to health equity and health challenges of the BIPOC community, we decided to take our journey and make it be a benefit and positive for others, especially as it pertains to the BIPOC community. So my husband and I co-founded the National Organization of African Americans with Cystic Fibrosis. And so, as part of our organization, we want to do what we can to be that rare voice, especially for underprivileged, underrepresented organizations. And so we do that in numerous ways. So you're probably thinking, you know, it's nice that you're sharing all this good stuff, but how does this tie into newborn screening? This is what's interesting as it pertains to newborn screening. The beautiful thing about newborn screening is that by law, every state is doing newborn screening. So technically, everybody is, or at least should be, screened for cystic fibrosis. So if you go back to my husband, with newborn screening had made a difference with him 54 years prior. By the way, he just turned 60 years old in August, which is The more challenging news as it pertains to newborn screening and cystic fibrosis is the fact that there's a limited variant panel that's often used and more enriched in European and white dominant variants. My husband has 2 rare mutations. You will find other African Americans and BIPOC groups that have rare mutations. If you look at the CFTR variant panel that they use, it usually does not include those rare mutations. You will find the common, again, variants that typically are more relevant to white individuals, including Delta F508. So would it have made a difference? It wouldn't have, because if the panels do not include those rare mutations, then it's going to be missed, which is one of the reasons we advocate for Terry Wright's law, to make sure that the variants included on the panels are more extensive and inclusive. And that's why we also developed the right cystic fibrosis screening tool to help individuals potentially self-diagnose the symptoms and then follow up with a healthcare professional to confirm. So that is where we are. We're so excited. I was so excited when Natasha reached out to me and to see what her organization is doing, the Everlife Foundation is doing in newborn screening, because newborn screening is saving lives. And I get excited to see the progress that has been made. And the fact that we're here even discussing health equity as it pertains to newborn screening gives me so much hope as far as the direction that we are going and the recognition that we still have more work to do. So that's a little bit of my story. Rare disease is very important to me. I myself was diagnosed with systemic lupus erythematosus on Valentine's Day of 1994. I know, where's the love, right? Valentine's Day. So I can relate directly to the challenges of having a rare disease. I can also relate directly to the challenges of the pain and the burden that a caretaker has to deal with. And someone said earlier, I believe it was you, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but you say if we had the diagnosis earlier, then so much more could have been done. And that's the power of newborn screening. Do you know my husband was almost in his 40s. He didn't have the diagnosis of fibrosis until the age of 54. But in his 40s, a doctor decided after this 8-hour surgery to put him on enzymes. You know, that made a difference, a simple prescription of enzymes where he could start to eat and keep food down. So I agree with you, the earlier we can get these diagnoses, it's a world of difference. Think about all the surgeries he had. He has had a total of 23 surgeries. Think about all the surgeries he had that could have been avoided. And so again, that's why I get so excited, and I wanted to be here all the way from Little Rock, Arkansas. That was a long trip. Because if you think about what these groups are doing in synergy, it's making a difference, not just about life, but quality of life. So that just kind of touches base, give you an overview of who I am. And I don't know if I'm supposed to take any questions or anything, but I hope you all go easy on me.
I don't know if you're familiar, but cystic fibrosis is on the Nutrition Equity Act, the Medical Nutrition Equity Act. And if you go to nutritionequity.org, you can also tell your story there and contact legislators on it.
Thank you. And if anybody knows how to work with laws, please see me and I can tell you more about what's going on.
I would like to ask you, how do you break that wall of, I don't know how to express it, but to me, a disease doesn't have color, skin, religion, political affiliation. But unfortunately, every time you hear more and more that, for example, sickle cell only Black people can have, or thalassemia only people with Middle Eastern background. So how do you make that breakthrough to let them know that it doesn't have a skin color or political affiliation to make it happen?
And that's one of the reasons we embrace our story. One of the questions I always ask, are you bitter? Did you get mad? We didn't have time for that. We have to make a difference. That comes through education, wonderful forums like this, and really sharing your story, which again is one of the reasons we started the National Organization of African Americans with Cystic Fibrosis. We have been fortunate. We have been featured in JAMA, USA Today, but we also been part of numerous platforms that we've had the opportunity to speak and share our story. And it's important that everybody do their job to educate that these rare and genetic diseases do not belong to any one particular race or ethnicity. We have to change that narrative.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. You can either stay here or sit to see the screen, whichever you prefer.
I stay here, it's comfortable.
Okay. So next we have a recording from Dr. Michelle Lloyd-Perrier, who is a pediatrician and geneticist, and she has held many, many roles. I have to say she is one of the first people I met in this space, and I've learned so much from her. But she is going to be speaking a bit about, her presentation will be a bit about the history and really thinking about equity throughout the history of newborn screening.
Good morning. Dr. Howell is unavailable to travel, and I will be babysitting. So we apologize for our absence. And I bring you a special aloha from the Big Island of Hawaii. Today, I will be giving a short overview of newborn screening, outlining some of the challenges, and laying out some future considerations, and introducing with a case study the concept of equity and the challenge of assuring equity within newborn screening. What is newborn screening? It occurs all over the world. In the United States, about 4 million infants are screened per year to detect conditions that threaten their life and long-term health. Currently, about 35% of babies worldwide receive newborn screening for at least one condition. More than 15,000 babies are diagnosed and treated annually in the US after laboratory or nursery-based newborn screening. And newborn screening conditions are represented by about 275 to 1,300 genes. So the goals, the longstanding goals of newborn screening are to prevent or reduce the catastrophic health consequences to individuals and family. And these include premature death, mental disabilities, and physical disabilities. It's a state-based system. In most countries, it's a national system, but here in the United States, it's state-based, and states make up their newborn screening programs depending on national scientific guidelines and recommendations, the financial cost of screening, and funding sources for the newborn screening, the frequency of disorder within the state, sometimes that's considered, and the availability of treatment for each condition within the state. The greatest challenge facing newborn screening and new treatment development stems from the conditions most amenable to screening themselves, and that's rare diseases. When we wrote our paper, The Progress and Future of U.S. Newborn Screening Programs, we considered where newborn screening programs came from, the current status of newborn screening programs today, and some of the challenges and solutions to those challenges as we go forward. So, for example, with rare diseases, simply gathering enough evidence to justify screening is more difficult with rare diseases. What if you just have one infant with that rare disease? And by the way, you may hear a background noise of a child crying. That's my grandson. So we propose recommendations on improving the newborn screening system and addressing specific demands to grow its capacity by better defining the criteria by which screening targets are established, financing the newborn screening system's capacity to respond to that expansion, including engagement and funding from stakeholders, creating a national quality assurance, data, IT, and communications infrastructure, and improving intra-governmental communications. What drives changes? Well, historically, changes to newborn screening programs have been driven by the development in science and technology and patient and family advocacy, and that continues. Those two are the main driving forces of changes in newborn screening. But it's also sometimes actions from providers treating the rare disorders, and federal and state funding, and also policies that they may develop. And then now we have the Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children, and those recommendations also drive changes. Science and technology demands that we've seen include the expansion of clinical trials and treatments for rare diseases. Genome and exome sequencing have opened more opportunities for early identification across the lifespan for an individual, and the development of gene panels for more comprehensive newborn screening. And this is also leads to the possibility of high throughput genomic sequencing. We can see that on horizon, likely to overtake targeted genotyping and microarrays. And then finally, what I think is significant is the ability to develop the kind of information systems infrastructure we need. And that's an essential requirement for achieving equity. So what are the current gaps? The basic, just understanding the disease mechanisms and detection of disease. Some translational gaps still exist, where you need the ability to develop large enough and population-based studies to establish clinical validity, and clinical gaps, how to capture and aggregate case-level data nationally to inform our understanding of variations in disease presentation. And again, all this relies on information systems infrastructure, as well as the science and technology. So how is the newborn screening system responding to pressures for changes? Most parts of the newborn screening system work well for screening, follow-up, and diagnosis, but the demands to incorporate advanced genetic and genomic science demand a system that integrates a learning healthcare system model, and this, so it's more iterative, it's more dynamic than what we're currently seeing, and it also demands a kind of interchange between the private clinical system and the scientific system, as well as the public health agencies. So it's a lot more dynamic than what we're seeing now. So solutions to increasing this kind of iterative learning system capacity, we need to focus public health newborn screening on treated form of the disease that led to additions to the recommended uniform screening panel, to the prioritize development of a national infrastructure to aggregate the state data. Increased funding is needed for both the pilot studies and the evidence reviews, and encourage and facilitate regional partnerships between clinical investigators and newborn screening programs for the kind of translational science we need. And again, this all demands an increase in infrastructure and national standardization, which we don't really have. So on to equity. Newborn screening right now does rest on the foundation of equity. It's universal, and screening is paid for by insurers and/or state fees or a combination of payment methods. So it's available theoretically to everyone, and newborn screening programs prize them on the universality and the issue of equity. But the system may fail beyond short-term follow-up. And achievement of equity is very dependent on, in our country, on individual access to health care. So whereas you may screen, diagnose, and in terms of being a part of short-term follow-up, the ability to then monitor the system and ensure long-term follow-up is where our system, depending on the state, may often fail. An example I want to use for this is sickle cell disease. So approximately 90% of persons with a diagnosis of sickle cell disease are African American in this country, but the disease also occurs amongst Hispanic Americans, persons of Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and Indian descent. As an orphan disease, or one that affects less than 200,000 persons nationwide, sickle cell disease does not receive the research funding and pharmaceutical investment directed to other orphan diseases. For example, cystic fibrosis affects fewer than half the number of persons, but receives 3.5 times the funding from NIH and 440 times the funding from national foundations. Persons living with sickle cell disease usually have less access to comprehensive care and more difficulty in obtaining medication for pain relief than persons with other chronic diseases. And that's because often the physicians in both primary care settings and in emergency settings do not necessarily have a grasp of the disease. Most persons living with sickle cell disease are publicly insured, and Medicaid recipients with the disease have substantial barriers to receiving necessary services. Despite the low prevalence of sickle cell disease, the costs associated with managing the disease is high, and the disease has long-term complications. Healthcare providers with expertise in the treatment of sickle cell disease are in short supply, and disease-modifying treatments are limited. Newborn screening shows that screening at birth is associated with improvements in infant mortality in states with Medicaid. And in contrast, newborn screening mandates were not linked to significant declines in infant mortality in states without Medicaid. indicating the importance of access to healthcare and treatments. So ending with this, until there is uniform, fair, and established access to essential treatments for conditions diagnosed through newborn screening, we will have failed to fulfill our obligations we assumed by promoting such screening programs, an essential part of equity. Measuring equity is important, as I said earlier. National surveillance systems can help determine where to allocate health systems resources and what gaps exist in clinical research. The ability to accurately determine the benefits of coordinated comprehensive care and to assess ongoing needs depends on the availability of surveillance data that can be used by researchers and policymakers to identify the population affected by sickle cell disease and other conditions, and to measure health outcomes, cost effectiveness, and quality of life. So our main recommendations, and we hope you'll go forward with some of these, is to enhance collaboration with clinical scientists to improve pilot study capacity, to establish an administrator at HHS to coordinate agency activities in research, delivery, and program evaluation, improve data information technology and communications infrastructure, and this includes interoperability with computable terminologies, infrastructure that aggregates case-level data in national registries to inform our understanding of range of severity and penetrance levels, and to consider multi-state regional pilot studies.
So now I invite Amy Biglio up. She is a certified genetic counselor and public health genetics consultant who's been working in the newborn screening and rare disease space for the past 14 years. She's a consultant with many groups, including the CDC, APHL. We are lucky that she works with us as well, and really is someone who, she didn't write this in her bio, this is me adding. You know, I can think of very few people who are just like at the center of so much in newborn screening and the rare disease space as Amy. She brings her public health background into the conversation, which I think is really critical. We've talked about state-run newborn screening programs, but she's also looking at data across what does it mean to look at data from a state perspective to a national perspective with the work she's doing at CDC, and then also just what does this actually mean for real families every day, day in and day out. So really appreciate to have you joining us, Amy.
That's a lot of pressure. So thank you so much to Natasha and her team at Expecting Health and Every Life Foundation to allow me to stand up here and talk to you about a topic that I am really quite passionate about, and one that I hope we as a newborn screening community can continue to talk about, but more importantly, do something about. So if I can get my... So for my time today, I want to walk us through kind of three main topic areas. As the daughter of an English teacher, I often like to start my talks with a level set on terminology, just to make sure that we're all speaking the same language. From there, we'll talk a bit about where disparities do exist in the newborn screening system, and Michelle set me up in such a lovely way already, so that's fantastic. And then from there, I will talk about what we as advocates can actually do about it. So let's start with some terminology. So I think it's not uncommon in the media, in the literature, to see a lot of these terms used interchangeably, and that's not always appropriate. So when we talk about health disparities, what we're talking about are preventable differences in the burden of disease and our opportunities to achieve one's ideal health. And these are linked to underlying social, economic, and our environmental disadvantages, which means not all health differences are actually health disparities. I'll use the example of increased concussion rates in NFL players. That is a health difference. There are higher concussion rates in NFL players than non-NFL players, but because that is not linked to underlying disadvantage, we would not consider that a health disparity. You may also see the term health inequity, and I think this is very, very closely related to health disparity. And again, this is differences in health outcomes that again can be traced to some underlying unequal economic or social conditions that are systemic, avoidable, and unfair. So what do we mean when we talk about health equity? Really what we're talking about is social justice in health. We are saying that our goal is that no one is denied the possibility to be healthy simply for belonging to a group that has historically been economically or socially disadvantaged. If we try to tie this all together and think about how health disparities work with health equity, health disparities are typically the metric that we use to measure our progress, or more often our lack thereof, in reaching health equity. All right, so with that foundation, let me talk a little bit about where we see disparities in the newborn screening system. And we see them everywhere, across the entirety of the system. We see them in laboratory and follow-up. We see them in education and advocacy. We see them in rare disease research and clinical trials. Before I spend some time delving into each of these, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that this in no way means that newborn screening isn't successful and isn't life-saving. What it does mean is that we need to be focusing on acknowledging that while also thinking about how can we do better? How can we continue to make this a better program? So I think you're probably familiar with some of these disparities that we see across newborn screening programs, and I've heard this a little bit as I've been here. We know that condition panels across newborn screening programs in the US, across the world, are not equal. We have conditions being screened for in some states that are not being screened for in other states. I put what I hope is somewhat of a provocative question up there, is that we often rely on this idea that we need to mandate newborn screening because it needs to be equal within states, within a state border. But should that also apply across state borders? And if the answer is yes, what do we need to do to promote, support newborn screening programs who find themselves in a really under-resourced public health system in this country? The other two bullets may be a little bit newer for those of you not super into the lab portion of newborn screening, but how screening is done is actually not the same. So even if we look at, we'll use cystic fibrosis for an example. One state may screen for cystic fibrosis using a 36 variant panel, and others may use a 139 variant panel. The use of tiered testing, which can reduce false positives or increase our chance of detection, may differ between states. The ability to use molecular technologies, doing things like gene sequencing, so that is provided by the state instead of having to be covered and get prior authorization out in the community. These are all different nuances that can happen within programs. The last bullet is, we do within a state, we screen all babies essentially the same way. That might not be the best way for every baby. And what we do see, and we have evidence that some analytes actually differ based on your ancestral origin, which means you may be, as a Black or African American baby, more likely to have false positive results than a white baby, or a white baby may be more likely to be missed than an Asian baby. So we need to look at our analytes and the differences that they present in our ancestral group. This is a bit of a preview of a talk that I'm giving later at the APHL meeting, but I took one of our data repositories and I pulled all of the cases that were identified by newborn screening. And I was curious to know whether, even in the presence of newborn screening, was the time of diagnosis different between reported races. And I started with cystic fibrosis because, as we've heard, it is a predominantly, though not exclusively, white condition. And what we saw is that even with newborn screening, Black African-American babies have longer times to diagnosis than Asian and white babies. And likely this is because of the lack of education that we heard about, that people still think this is not something we will see in a Black or African-American baby. And then I tried to flip the script. I looked at the hemoglobinopathies or sickling diseases, which again, what Michelle just talked about, again, in this country, historically, predominantly seen in African-American babies, though again, certainly not exclusively. And here we don't see that difference. Black and African-American babies and white babies are diagnosed with the same thing. Same symptom. Why is that? I don't have the answer, but we need to look into it. We've talked about disparities in times to, or time to intervention, access to treatment. This is, I'm certain, not new to anyone in this room, but I do want to talk about it not being a new issue. I think it's been highlighted more because of things like gene and cell therapies that have these exorbitant. This is not a new issue for us. Medical foods and formulas, which most of our families need, are typically not covered by insurance, and they are very expensive. I think we also need to understand that these treatments, when you actually kind of look at them across the lifespan, they need to be taken across the lifespan. They easily start getting into that multi-million-dollar number that we see, that we're also concerned about all of a sudden. Certainly the gene and cell therapy issue is one we're going to continue to see, which is not a bad thing because it's great that we're having gene and cell therapies, but the multi-million-dollar price tag, that is an issue. I actually did a quick look on GoFundMe, and there's over 500 campaigns for people with SMA right now to try to get their treatment. That is not okay. So I also want to talk a bit, and this may be preaching a bit to the choir here, about disparities that we see in education and advocacy. And I'm sure many of you know that different families, different disease organizations, different groups, they have varying access to resources, skill sets, the opportunities to actually advocate for their disease. So what does that mean? It means, oh, you know what, I put it up here, but not on there. There we go. What that means is that there may be some diseases that don't get on newborn screening panels, even if they meet criteria, because there's no one there advocating. There's no one there to put that nomination package through. We go upstream, it can mean that your disease isn't taken up by a drug company to develop the treatment that you need to get on the newborn screening panel. And I know Natasha and I have talked about this for probably a decade now, that we need to go beyond the brochure when we're talking about education. Please, it's such an antiquated way to teach people. It doesn't reflect most people's learning styles these days, and there certainly are a lot better modalities to really get education and awareness across to different groups. We know as well, and I'm sure you guys know probably better than I do, that there are disparities in rare disease research and clinical trials. There is a huge lack of diversity in rare disease research, and understanding, including having someone at the table does not necessarily mean that those benefits are going to be guaranteed for those populations. You said you came from Tuskegee. There has been historical systemic discrimination and stigmatization in research, which prevents certain populations from wanting to participate in research, and understandably so. So what does it mean when we say we need to gain trust in a system? What do we mean? What does trust mean? What does it look like? How do we know we've achieved it? And how is it going to be different for each and every community? When you look at a lot of the research grant proposals or calls for research, there's actually a lot of lack of attention to trying to address disparity issues. That's not included in some of the research. So how do we get some of our federal partners, some of our organizations, state funders, grants, to really require that these types of questions get answered or get addressed when you're applying for research? So that was a lot. So what can we do about it? I put 3 kind of main action items here. This list is in no way exhaustive. I tried to just kind of keep it broad, but I think first and foremost, we have to understand that newborn screening is the system. It is more than just getting your disease on the getting on a panel and having people test for it. If we're going to mandate this, we best be sure that every child who is affected has access to the treatment, which is ultimately the reason we said we needed to screen for it anyways. We need to commit to addressing the issue and not just discussing them. Natasha knows that I get super cranky talking about the same thing over and over without actually saying, great, now what? What are we going to do about it? It's not enough for us just to know that these exist. We need to start thinking outside the box. We need to start putting pressure on actually doing something about this. And then finally, we need to advocate for inclusion of diverse populations in all parts of newborn screening. I really want to highlight the last part. Inclusion is not just a checkbox. It's not just like, yay, I got so many people around the table, check, done, nailed it. It means you're engaging these people, you are they feel like they are true and committed partners, and they're participating. So really, just making sure that when we say inclusion, we're really talking about the entirety of a real, true partnership. So with that, I thank you so much, and I really look forward to questions and discussion.
Great, thank you, Amy. So we'll start with a couple of questions that I have, but then we will turn it over and to the people in the room and online for any questions. But my first question is actually for you, Amy. What was the impetus to look at the data in this way? And I promise this isn't like a plant question, because I just realized I never had asked her this question. We've been talking about it. So, what drove you to say, let me look at this from this different lens?
That is a good question. So I think it was twofold. So I, for a while, worked at the Minnesota Newborn Screening Program, and I was their follow-up coordinator. And so I had anecdotally seen differences, and that certain geography, certain race population, certain education level, it was harder for us to follow up. It took longer to get a diagnosis. We really had to fight for the treatment. So part of it was just anecdotally having seen it and wanting to kind of take that to the next step and have data to show it. I think the other piece of it was that I've always kind of questioned whether newborn screening was as universal as we were hailing it to be. And I wanted to kind of look and say, should we be saying that? And if we shouldn't be saying that, why shouldn't we be saying that? And where do we need to focus our efforts?
I think that's a really good lesson. Sometimes when we're in the midst of doing something, we sometimes don't want to kind of peek under the covers and see, well, let me see, is this really going on? Is what I'm saying really matching? But, that's how we all improve. And I think we're really at a time where we can be supportive of each other and say, yeah, things have been going well, and maybe there's some improvements, and we have to be self-reflective about that. My next question is for Michelle. I really appreciate how you said, that sometimes people ask you, are you bitter? And you're like, we don't have time for that. I think there are plenty of people who'd be like, oh, I have plenty of time to be bitter. And petty and all the other things. But even if it isn't bitterness, there are people and communities who just kind of feel like, healthcare, XYZ systems have not been there for me. Why should I be there for them? And, how do you combat that when we also have messages of, we need to get more involved? Those of us who, for whichever reasons, whichever labels are seen as underrepresented, even if that means historically excluded from the conversation. So it's kind of like, sometimes there's two different, we really need you to get involved. And it's kind of like, well, but that hasn't seemed valued in the past. How do you address that in the work that you do?
I have a motto that if I can help just one person, then my work and my living is not in vain. I would never forget, not too long ago, I got a phone call from a young Black female around 23 years old. She panicked. She was hysterical because her baby was just diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. And she took that as a death sentence. And I knew I had to reach out to her. And I told her the story of my husband. I said, he just celebrated his 60th birthday and was not diagnosed until the age of 54. Look at all the technologies and research and breakthroughs, modulators, everything we have now. I said, your babies should live a long, prosperous life. And she said, I just needed someone to tell me it's going to be okay. So when you get out and you start doing this beautiful thing called advocacy, and you see how you can touch the life of just one person, whether it's with a smile, a word, a law, or just your own personal testimony, all of a sudden, it almost makes everything you've gone through worth it. So really, to be honest, we are so grateful for this journey. But because without our journey, we wouldn't be able to do what we do to make a difference in the lives of others.
That's awesome. It's beautiful. Let's see if there are any questions out here in the audience. Oh, yeah. Oh, hands going up. All right. I'm sure we can get, and I think we can get a microphone out to you all. Yes, let's we can start on this side of the room. There's a question at the front.
It's my neighbor.
At least things fell before the microphone arrived here. Quick question, with Expecting Health and really growing your advocacy and stakeholders involved, I noticed that you had patient advocacy organizations. Do you plan to grow for more individual advocates that maybe don't know where they belong in terms of a nonprofit or a patient advocacy organization? Is it individualized yet, or is there a mentorship program maybe we can look to for the future for newer advocates to refer them to, possibly?
Yeah, those are great questions. Through the work of Expecting Health, we do work with patient advocacy organizations as well as individuals. So our ambassador program in newborn screening, it's individuals. And I also know that, Every Life has similar types of programs that are for individuals, and whether you're representing an organization or you're looking for an organization to be a part of. Yep. So there are definitely opportunities for whether you're super affiliated or learning on your own.
Yeah.
Other hands that were
Quick question for you, Amy, but anyone else on the panel. But thinking about new programs at the state level and comparing those to other public health programs where there's a lot more data available and the programs are seemingly a lot more transparent. I came from infectious disease public health, so a lot of data availability. You can look at disparities pretty easily. And when you go to state websites for newborn screening programs, it's not there. And I know we have to balance privacy issues, a lot smaller ends. But if you could comment maybe on the need for data and how we can access data to address some of those issues.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So you're right. I think historically programs have kept their data very close to their chest, and much of that is there is a much higher scrutiny around a mandated program that did not get consent on newborns, on rare diseases, like you said, that are potentially identifiable just because they're small numbers. But I think, and I'm hoping that there is a bit of we'll call it a renaissance right now, where we are understanding how important it is for us to start aggregating our data more, because that's the only way we're going to learn about rare diseases. Honestly, a single state is never going to have enough cases to actually learn what's going on and or to be able to assess some of these issues. So I know there's a project I'm working on at the CDC, which we are trying to build a national newborn screening data platform. It may be my retirement gift to the community, but we'll get it done. And I think there's a lot of new technologies out there, privacy enhancing technologies, where I think we can strike that balance of making sure people feel like their data is protected, that it's not identifiable, while contributing to these really important questions that we need to answer. So I think we're moving in that way, though I acknowledge and agree that we have been a bit slower to the uptake on that. It may be a finding that there's been a lot more money into this kind of effort that we can engage in.
I have two questions, but I'm going to try to go very fast. Earlier this week, I was in Washington, D.C., and I met with a wonderful foundation leader I looked it up, it's Color for Crohn's and Chronic Illness, and we were talking specifically around language in the space that we're in. And I really liked, Amy, that you started your slides with discussing language and terminology, because she brought up something that was really just right in our faces as humanity and working in research. And what she said was, we were talking about clinical trials. Why does it have to be called a trial? My Black community has a visceral reaction to the word trials.
Yeah.
Why are we saying trials? Why aren't we saying studies? How do we get back to these different languages? So I wanted to know if in all your past that you guys have all traveled through, has there been discussions about languages that we use in this field?
I think that's a really good point. And, one of the words that we really don't use at Expecting Health is pedigree when people are thinking about, doing what we always call a family tree. The technical term is like doing like I don't know, a pedigree. But when we would talk to families about that, they would say, pedigree, you do that for animals, and you don't do that for people, or you shouldn't do that for people, right? So even something like that around family history, that is so, you would think so benign, but there are those instances. And so that's one that's always stuck out for me. But I think there are plenty of examples that we could probably, if people would just share, and we would listen, saying, that makes me a little bit uncomfortable. We've had that come up in some of our work around the word training. Like, again, the idea of training someone to do something, that's like you train your pet to do something. If you're trying to educate me and engage with me, let's use some other language. So, but I think yours it's a good point. We should be really open to hearing what words aren't working. We shouldn't just assume that everyone has the same association with these different words.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think there's been a lot, we try to tell people, don't call it the PKU test, call it newborn screening, for the love of God. It's not the same thing. Or the switch from mutation to variant, mutation has a pretty negative connotation. And so I think there has continued to be this evolution of language, and I think it's so important. And I love what you brought up in that example, because I think we do need to think about, are we getting in our own way when we're trying to talk about things, and really questioning all of the language that we use. I am a strong advocate for that.
I'm going to add to that, if you don't have the right people at the table
Yeah.
to help with those discussions,
That's a good point, yeah.
it's in vain. And that's why I appreciate Expecting Health and Everlight Foundation. Sometimes you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable to get to that point.
Amen.
The other was a comment, but it was kind of really quickly about when I saw the information going up about sickle cell. But I had to say this because it just kind of talks to about a couple of decades, much longer than that, just personally of what we felt. And I don't like to draw personally back to what we do. But 24 years ago now, my daughter had a very specific surgery at a hospital that I won't name. I'm from Michigan. But
What block?
But what happened was they thought she had a streptococcus bacterial pneumonia, and because of that, they wanted to quarantine her. And when they put her into the quarantine, which they did, there was one young lady in that room with her that was way back in the corner with all the window shades pulled, and I will never forget it, and she had sickle cell. And her mother was working 2 jobs and was going to school to become a practicing attorney, and she couldn't stay with her daughter, and she was a single mom, and this little girl was in pain. And she was 14 and she was in pain. My daughter ended up being in the hospital for 45 days. We thought we were going to lose Jenny. She had 4 surgeries. But in those 45 days, we were with this young lady because this mom couldn't be there. And my friends asked, what can I do to help? Well, they were allowed to come into this room, but why this young lady was in this infectious disease controlled room with sickle cell is just another example of how the health disparities were just so magnificent and in front of you. So that when friends asked, how can we help? I said, come and sit with our new friend. Come help our new friend. And just because mom couldn't be there all the time, to this day, she is a practicing attorney now, and Jenny and her are friends.
Oh, I love that.
But it's still sad for me to see all of that disparity.
It's a perfect segue.
So, hi, my name is Tanika. I'm the ED of the Sickle Cell Coalition of Maryland, and I also have sickle. One of the things that I've been struggling with is that sickle cell patients are really angry, and they don't want to participate in clinical trials because when they transition over into adulthood, they're treated as drug addicts, they're ignored, and it's like we're at a time with gene therapy right now, and there is so much progression, but patients don't want to be involved. And so one of the things I've been trying to work through and understand, and my question to the 3 of you is, how do you bring in a group of people who have been ignored for over 100 years? Like, we literally just got our first 2 medications 2 years ago. And in comparison to cystic fibrosis, there's about 16 plus medications. I like to call sickle cell disease the poster child of health disparities. Like, we are at the bottom of everything, to the point where 2 weeks ago, Senator Booker and Senator Chris Van Hollen had to introduce a sickle cell bill because prior to the 1972 sickle cell disease bill through the Black Panthers, and also, after that, no research money has been sent to sickle cell disease. And so it's like, we're at this amazing pivotal time, but how do you get patients to engage? How do you get people to show up? And we keep hearing the same stories. I don't care, they don't care about me, and patients don't even, show up to hospitals in crisis now. So I was just curious about any strategies that you all are thinking through for sickle cell disease, as it is, one of the primary, rare diseases that affect Black people, and they're just so angry and just really don't want to be involved.
I'll try to take a stab. So I think, first of all, they should be angry. And so one, I think we as a community need to start by acknowledging and apologizing. And I know that's not going to take away, but if we don't acknowledge the role that we as scientists, as geneticists played in many of the hurt that this population is feeling, I wouldn't trust that either if I did not have someone acknowledge that to me. So I think first and foremost, we need to put ourselves out there and do that. I think the other thing is including people across the entirety of the development process. It's too late, in my opinion, to come to a community and say, here's this thing that we created for you without you. And so, there's that sign, nothing about us without, or for us or about us without us, like that, so I think if there are ways that the community is involved from the beginning at every stage, that can help. That doesn't get you a solution for the gene therapy that is already there. I don't know, Natasha, if you have thoughts on, in something like this where the product is already available and bringing people to the table at that point.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think that we get really excited and want people to join us doing our thing, as opposed to saying, we want to connect with you. What do you want to partner on, right? So it's like, come and join us and learn about this clinical trial, or come and join us and work on this work group. And sometimes people are like, I don't want to do that for all the reasons that you listed. And what if we kind of changed it and said, I want to learn more about you. How do I meet you where you are? And maybe it isn't, come join this session to learn about why clinical trials are amazing, but we're going to do a listening session, and I really want to hear all of it from you, the anger as well as what you're hoping for. And I don't think that should be on, like, I'm looking at you directly, like your shoulders as the lead of this organization. I think it's for people who are, creating the drugs, creating the interventions, to say, no, you also need to be there to listen to what people may be doing, and not as just a recruitment tool, not as a recruitment model, but as you're in this space, then be in this space and really listen.
I'm going to share my personal story. I understand our history. I don't know if I share. I was born in the hospital. They did the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. John A. Andrews Hospital, right on the campus of Tuskegee. But you need to start having people to engage that look like you. So for a part of my life, I was CEO at the Red Cross. I covered about 52 hospitals, Arkansas, Springfield, Tennessee. And one of the things that continuously came up, we cannot get enough blood for our sickle cell babies. Well, that baffled me. I couldn't understand, why couldn't we not get enough blood? So I was told as the CEO, Black people would not give blood. I said, okay, but why?
Mm-hmm.
I was told, Black people, we have a fear of needles. Well, I decided to put a forum together because I wanted to really understand, is it mistrust? Is it a fear of needles? Is it because nobody asking, we're not addressing, it's not important? A lot of interesting things came up, including that a lot of times when Blacks came to give blood, they were anemic and could not give blood. But long story short, my team and I decided to do a collaboration with a group of 40 community churches. Because I believe whatever you need is right in your own backyard if all of us just give a little bit more. And we set history. I met with several people from the sickle cell community. I have sickle cell trait. And they came in, and it was important to me also for my staff to hear from people with sickle cell. Sometimes you have to show people what they're advocating for. So we brought in the children. We brought in this guy that was 50-something years old. We brought in mothers. And all of a sudden, it went from just being a job for my staff to being a passion and advocacy, community advocacy. But long story short, we brought together a community that normally did not come together to give blood. And we made history with the largest blood drive of African Americans in the history of our region with the Red Cross. And we did it because I knew I had to lead by example. I was the CEO and I was scared to give blood. I had mistrust of certain things. And I said, if I can't lead by example, it wouldn't happen. So the sickle cell community came out, they partnered with us, and we made a difference. But again, it's gonna take sometimes people that, across the diverse platform. And sometimes people need to look like you being at the table.
Other questions? Oh, please.
I have a question about telehealth, and I know Dr. Wright takes calls from people and you answer questions, and your advocacy groups do that. But I'm wondering about genetic counselors. Will telehealth help you guys because there aren't very many of you, and you can go further because you can be a telehealth person?
I wish Sylvia could come up here. She knows more about telehealth than I do. I think there's the potential for telehealth to be beneficial. I think there is risk, depending on how things go post-COVID and some of the cross-boundary or cross-border kind of leeway we've had, that could continue to be an issue of being able to provide care across borders. I don't know if you have anything to add, Sylvia, that you want to scream out, but. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Just for those who are on the live stream and who aren't able to hear, it was shared that there are companies that are doing telehealth, genetic counseling, and also with the pandemic and a real push to telehealth, that there are some rules and regulations that are now kind of aligning with allowing telehealth to be more accessible. Including not just in genetic counseling, but particularly in that space. I think we have enough time for one more question.
I just want to add to that. I would like to see telehealth be allowed across state lines.
Yeah.
That's one thing I would like to see, because we just dealt with a young lady with CL that because she does not have the diagnosis, even though they know it's CL, she has the variants, but there's some gray area with her sweat test. She's not getting the medicine she needs, and now she's on a feeding tube and oxygen. There is a physician who's willing to help her, but in another state.
Yeah.
But because of the laws with telehealth, she cannot get the help she needs. So that is one thing I would like to see more people advocate for.
It's so important in rare disease as well, where many times there's not an expert within your state borders.
All right, so we have time for one more question.
Okay, quick question. I am trying to, so I don't know the doctor side of things. I'm trying to find out for newborn screening in the medical school community, when they learn about different things, is newborn screening ever taught? And the reason that I ask this is because the chief of neurology of a hospital contacted me about the number of Black babies being tested in their area. And she said some of the things that she was seeing in clinic should have been caught at newborn, or at least at the first 6 months. And I was explaining to her, she said she had never really heard, she didn't know what the newborn screening process was. So I'm trying to find out. My thing is always educate people about the whole process so that they can make better informed decisions. And with that, is there something that we could do in the medical pre-med or medical, or even when they're going through their fellowship, to go in and offer them training to say, hey, if you have a parent or the expectant person that is having a baby, this is what you need to do.
So, and Natasha, feel free to, I think that is actually a huge gap. I would say not only for newborn screening, but genetics in general, in terms of understanding, different genetic changes, variants, genetics versus genomics. So I think it's often not taught very well in medical school, if at all. And so I would also say, even if it is, it's hard to know what they're being told. And it is difficult, I think, as well. Newborn screening needs to be this kind of lifelong learning process, because if you train in one state and you go to another state, you have to learn what that state is doing. So I think that is absolutely an opportunity for improving education and knowledge, not only around newborn screening, but some of the things that we've brought up about these diseases not necessarily exclusively being seen in certain ancestral groups anymore. I was just at a meeting, and there was a dean of a medical school there who we were talking about why people still don't know genetics very much. And he pretty much said it's because it's not on the board exam. And until it's on the board exam, they don't care. They're studying for the board. They want to pass their boards. And so if it's not on the board exam, they maybe get told it, but they're not really focused on it. So we need to get it on the board.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this excellent panel. Thank you, first and foremost.